networking break, had a good coffee, had a good chat. We are now going to start our last session of the day on alternative vehicle technologies. And so we'll talk about different options that are available, natural gas, hydrogen, hybrids, electrics. And interestingly, I think the morning and the panel discussion now set up the scene quite well for these alternative technologies. If we look back at past events, we always had these alternative technologies to diesel as nice to have, but not happening for different reasons. And now with the upcoming targets on fuel efficiency, on fuel consumption, and CO2, it's clear that there is going to be a greater involvement and a greater share of alternative technologies in the market. So now I think the question is, what are the options exactly, and which options are more likely to be present and to be a contributor to the 2025 targets? Good. So we'll start talking about natural gas as one of these first alternative technologies. And for this, I have Martin Flach from Volvo, from IVECO. Sorry, from IVECO. And so thank you very much for joining us. Apologies for this small mistake. So Martin has been has held a number of positions in the commercial vehicle industry. His career began with Ford Motor Company, and then he joined IVECO Ford Truck in 1986, following the merge of IVECO and Ford Truck Division. And he remained with IVECO following the formation of IVECO Limited in 2003. He's currently product director with responsibility for the light, medium, and heavy product ranges. And prior to this role, he worked in Italy at the Brescia production plant and in IVECO headquarters in Turin as chief engineer responsible for the medium product range and as line manager for medium and heavy products. So yeah, Martin, thank you very much for coming. And Martin is going to be speaking on the natural gas truck market and technology developments. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
You can change your slides here.
Lovely. Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So what are we going to be talking about? It's really all about sustainability. And when we look in Europe, there's a fast changing demand. The world's changing. Since the Dieselgate issues of a few years ago, people are now looking at the effects of diesels. People are looking at emissions. And businesses are increasingly looking to be more green and sustainable. And we can see the sort of way that the whole truck history has moved over the years from, go back far enough and commercial vehicles would have been powered probably by wood, and then gradually by coal, and then by petrol, then by about the 1930s, diesel, and probably through 1930s through till sort of the post-war years, petrol and diesel were very much sort of in competition. By the time I joined the truck industry 40 years ago, petrol engine vehicles were still being produced, but in very, very small numbers. And really, by the time we got to the mid-80s, petrol engine vehicles had disappeared completely on medium and heavy trucks. Even on vans, if we go back a couple of years ago, we don't see any vans at 3.5 tons and above running on petrol. And then as we get through into the 2000s, we start to see natural gas becoming a fuel of choice. And increasingly now, very much biomethane becomes a fuel of choice. And what are the drivers behind it? Very much in the early days, it was about reducing noise, reducing pollutant emissions, which is still what we're trying to do today. It was about competitive costs, which we're still trying to do today. And nowadays, we're much more focused on CO2 as well. And then we've got to think also about air quality. So across Europe, there are now legal improvement requirements to improve air quality. In the UK, the government have lost multiple court cases on the fact that they have no real policy to improve air quality. Pretty much right across Europe, road transport is being blamed as the main source of emissions in all of the hotspot areas. And the sort of policy measures which seem to be coming in pretty much everywhere is restrict the older vehicles where the air pollution is above the limits. If I look, I'll focus on the UK. I'm a UK citizen, so it's the one I know best, but I'll show a little bit more across Europe. In the UK, by about 2020, we expect to see something between about 10 and 12 cities with some form of clean air zones. The first ones are going to be central London in 2019, going out into the Greater London area 2020, 2021. Leeds, Birmingham, Nottingham, Derby are all in the first wave of cities that are going to be affected. But if I look also at the map, and this is an example of London, you can produce a map the same as this for pretty much any city in Europe. And what you can see on there, the red bits are showing the areas, the streets where the NO2 limits are exceeded. So that's 40 micrograms per cubic metre. And the yellow bits are where it's just under, sort of 38 to 40. And those of you who know London can tell exactly the roads because they're exactly the places you'd expect them to be. And you can draw the same map for any other city. London, as we've said, 2019, ultra-low emission zone covering the central London area. And that then goes out in 2021 to a much more extended area in the north and the south of London. But if I look at across the UK, towns and cities which are actually over the limits, there's about 75 of them. So if all of those start to put in some form of clean air zone, some form of traffic management, you're hardly going to be able to drive in the UK without going through a town or a piece of road which will have an air quality emission standard on it. It's not really new. So if I go back far enough to 96, Sweden were the first to produce a low emission zone. 99, the EU brought out the Air Quality Directive, so nearly 20 years on, we're still struggling right across Europe to do much about it. 10 years ago, London brought out the low emission zone. That was for Euro 3 NOx and Euro 4 particulates. So you could take a Euro 3 vehicle, put a particulate trap on, and the vehicle was okay. And then you can see it going through into other towns, other cities, to the point where we see by about 2025, we've already had announcements from quite a few cities. So Paris, Rome, Grenoble, Madrid, Stuttgart, Dusseldorf, Oslo, Athens are all saying by about 2025, no diesels in the central areas. And it's really only the start of a journey. So we've seen that the announcement for the UK is going to be, if you're non-compliant, for a van, £20 to come in, and for a truck, about £100. Now, that will vary right across Europe, but it shows the level of charge to come into the congestion zone, into the clean air zone that is being proposed. Other places will be, you won't be able to come in. So, if anything, the charging gives you some degree of flexibility. Then the reality and past practice says it's only going to get tougher. So is diesel dead? Well, I would argue no. Dieselgate hasn't done any of us any favours. It's very much demonised a fuel which, if we look over the last few years, it's been easy to use, easy to store, easy to transport, easy to distribute. It's been a good fuel. It's got good energy density. You can drive a diesel vehicle in the city one day. You can drive it from Northern Europe right to Southern Europe the next day without any worry about will it or won't it do it. But it's a fossil fuel, so first of all, a problem. It's got a high carbon content per energy unit. European oil dependency is increasing. The North Sea is pretty much empty these days. We can't get away from the fact that diesel combustion does produce particulates. Diesel engines are intrinsically fairly noisy. You only have to ask BP about the risks of ecological damage from the Gulf of Mexico incident a few years ago. And the conclusion from all of that and hopefully there aren't any legislators on taxation here today, but we will only predict that taxation on diesel is going to go up. So we need to look at alternatives. We can't not look at alternatives. And I can look at it in a couple of ways. One is that it's got to be as efficient as diesel for things like cost of ownership, reliability, safety, etc. I've got to try and improve the environmental impact. So looking at global warming, CO2 emissions, air pollutants for air quality in the city. Be nice to reduce noise. It'd be nice to reduce oil dependency. And I need a distribution network. We're very fortunate that right across Europe, you don't have to go much more than about 10 kilometres ever to find a station where you can buy diesel. I can then look at it in another way and say, well, whereas in diesel one size does fit all, when I start to look at the alternatives, what I have to start looking at is the various types of operation of the vehicle, from, on one side, urban distribution, urban logistics, through regional operations, through national operations, through long haul. And what I can see is that the technologies that work in the different sectors are not one size fits all anymore. So electrics work very well in the urban area, but less so when we start to get to more long distance. And so we can go through, and the only one which really seems to work on pretty much everything to us is natural gas. Now that's a snapshot really of today. As we move forward into the future, we could well see that that picture will change, and some of the technologies which at the moment we say impossible, no benefit, could well become the actual one that is the good answer. And we can look at another way in terms of the various technologies and look at some factors like comfort, sustainability, payload, versatility, the range, autonomy, refueling infrastructure, and total cost of ownership. And a snapshot as of today, and this particular one was done in France, you can do the same thing pretty much anywhere across Europe. You'll probably see some slightly different answers varying on the cost of the various fuels and what incentives there are in each of the member states. But what you come up with is that the only two which really are as good alternatives to diesel at the moment today are biomethane in compressed natural gas or liquid natural gas. I always like to show this. So we talk natural gas vehicles. The first thing to bear in mind is natural gas vehicles are not new technology. This is a lovely picture of a Fiat bus charabanc from the 1930s. That was running on compressed natural gas. And then for those of you from the UK, you might remember photos of vehicles running around during the war years, where very often vehicles, petrol engine vehicles, were converted to run on town gas. Town gas wasn't natural gas, and it wasn't compressed. It was stored at little above atmospheric pressure in a big balloon on the roof, and quite effective, but it's a gaseous fuel running a spark ignition engine. Fundamentally, nothing has changed since then. Why do we do it? Well, when we start to look at the emissions, bit of a complicated chart, but essentially against Euro 6 limits, what we're seeing with our 460 horsepower, 13-litre engine, diesel engine is sort of just around about 60% of the limits for emissions. The gas engine on particulates, this is way less, sort of a 98% reduction against the diesel engine or the requirements. When we look at NOx, so around about 27% reduction for a diesel engine against the emissions standard, and we get about another 50% reduction of the gas vehicle against the diesel. And we've seen that not just on the test bench for the homologation cycles. We've done back-to-back testing both in France and in the UK, using PEMS on test cycles on the road. And we've tended to see about that same number, around about a 50% reduction in NOx. On CO2, typically around, it's 9% on the test cycle. We've seen anything between about 10 and 15% when out on the road. But the whole point with natural gas is don't go and use fossil natural gas necessarily. use it as a stepping stone to get to using biomethane. With biomethane, typically 85 to 95% reduction in CO2. So biomethane gives us an ability to make a lovely two-circle circular economy slide where the whole thing revolves around creating methane from food waste. So anaerobic digestion, which we'll see all over Europe nowadays. If you drive past farms and places, you'll see all these domes. They're generally anaerobic digesters, taking farm waste, food waste, and rotting it down to produce methane and fertilizer. So you use the methane to run the truck, to transport the food, to collect the food waste, to go back into the anaerobic digester. On the other side, you take the fertilizer from the anaerobic digester, you use it for the farming, and you collect the waste from the farm, and you go back into methanization, and great. And you say, oh yeah, but that's all cloud in the cuckoo land, pie in the sky, it's a long way off. Well, we were actually doing it. This was last year. One of our sister companies, New Holland, we're doing some prototype tractors running on methane. This was running with a farm down in Somerset called Wyke Farms. Any of you from the UK will know they produce an awful lot of cheese. And they've got a big anaerobic digestion system there, and we were running this tractor on a trial down there, running on methane from the farm. I hasten to say that the tank behind it was not full of the gas. The gas is in little tanks all over the vehicle, and the tank behind it was full of pig waste. So that's all great, but how's it all moving forward? If we look at the percentage of orders on heavy trucks over the last 3 or 4 years for methane-powered vehicles as opposed to diesel, if we go back to 2015, we were 1.8% of our orders were gas-powered vehicles. And over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen that grow to 5.7, 8.5, last year 13%. This year, not quite sure yet where we're going to finish, but it's going to be a lot higher than 13. And we see that really by about 2020, it's not impossible to think that about 20% of our heavy trucks will be gas-powered. And if we look at the way the registration growth is going, it's been quite phenomenal. And partially that's because we're bringing the products into the market that the customer wants. If we look at it another way, you can see a few years ago we were running with just up to 330 horsepower, generally much more for sort of distribution vehicles. By 2016, we were with 400 horsepower, now 460 horsepower, and you can see the way the curve is going up and the number of vehicles are increasing. So far, about 400 different companies running them, about 6,700 units in 25 countries, and we reckon about 400 million kilometres each year. So some pretty good numbers in terms of vehicles out there running. For us, it's 20 years we've been at it. If we have a look, go back 20 years, we were producing first trucks in 1996, first vans in 2000, and I won't read the whole slide to you, but now we get on to the point where we can do ADR, dangerous goods, we can do low tractors, we can do 6x2s, pretty much everything which customers might want, we can now produce gas variants. If I look at the various vehicle ranges, so on the light range, 3.5 to 7.2 tonnes with 136 horsepower on CNG. On the medium trucks, it's 11 to 16 tonnes, 210 horsepower, again CNG. When we get onto the heavier trucks, the smaller engines, 270, 330 horsepower, will be CNG only. The 9-litre engine, 400 horsepower, can be CNG or LNG. The 13-litre engine is going to be largely LNG, but CNG is possible on some of the variants. If I look at the daily, vans, chassis cabs, minibuses, range anything from 200 to 250 to 400 kilometres. On the smaller vehicles, we can also do a little petrol tank to give you a get-you-home capability. Manual or automatic gearbox, so very much a good vehicle for an urban operation. The medium truck, 6-litre, 6-cylinder engine, up to about 650 kilometres of range, and loads of combinations of layouts for customer demand. So you can see some of the layouts of tanks that you can have. And the sort of focus, the sort of thing which we're looking at is very much vehicles like this, which is a road sweeper. That's running somewhere in London. And I think it's that very vehicle we've sold to Islington Council recently. On the heavy vehicles, as we said, so CNG on one side, a combination of CNG and LNG. So you put an LNG tank one side, CNG tanks the other side. You say, what on earth you want to do that for? Well, in countries where there's not a vast amount of LNG infrastructure yet, the combination of LNG and CNG can work quite well. In countries where there's a lot of LNG infrastructure, then putting the CNG on doesn't really make a lot of sense. It just reduces the range. So pure CNG on a 4x2 will give me around about sort of 570, 600 kilometres. The CNG LNG combination can take me just over 1,000 kilometres, and the twin LNG tanks around about 1,600 kilometres. And that's just another way of showing the same sort of story, how we've gone from very early stages where the sort of typical operation was refuse, very much municipalities, niche vehicles for very much sustainability-driven organisations, through to now we're looking at long-distance vehicles in the mass market to people who are very much driven by the total cost of ownership of the vehicle, whilst at the same time wanting to be able to be sustainable. Just a few details on the gearbox. We've just put a new gearbox in the vehicle, which has got various things like the ability to do predictive cruise control and echo roll. So again, looking always to try and focus to get the best in the way of fuel consumption and emissions. The 13-litre engine, spark ignition, stoichiometric combustion, and looking at high flow rate fuel injectors, but a very simple engine which gives us very good reliability. And the key point for us is there's no EGR, no diesel particulate filter, no SCR. It's 100% gas, and it's a very simple technology. If we look at the sort of various combinations, you can see CNG, CNG plus LNG on standard tractors, 4x2s, low tractors for continental Europe where people want to keep to a 4-metre height. For the UK market, 6x2s, which represent about 90% of the UK market, and then rigids in 4x2s and 6x2s in various combinations. And just a couple of other slides showing the combinations of tanks you can do. So pretty much whatever you want to do, you can do. I talked about 1,600 kilometre range. We actually did something last year, a great fun trip. There's some guy there who was actually driving the truck as well. And we drove from John O'Groats to Land's End in the UK with a gas tractor with a trailer, grossed up at about 32 tonnes. That's about 1,350 kilometres in round numbers. We got there, we gassed to spare, and certainly had a couple of 100 kilometres of range left. So the 1,600 kilometre range, even driving in the Highlands of Scotland and down in Cornwall in the hills, we managed to prove that you can do it. So very much a few slides to conclude. For us, gas vehicles, good for the planet, good for NOx, good for particulates, good for CO2, even on fossil CO2, very good for CO2 if we can use biomethane, good on noise. We can get 71 dB on the peak noise test protocol, which where it's allowed will give you the opportunity for nighttime deliveries. TCOs against the total cost of ownership against diesel is very positive. It'll vary a bit country to country, but typically something in the region of about 9%. Fuel consumption in kilos of gas against litres of diesel can be anything around about 15%. Natural gas is pretty much right across Europe cheaper than diesel. And we're putting all the sort of fuel-saving technologies onto the gas vehicles now that we've put on the diesel vehicles over the last few years. At the same time, offering the same levels of comfort and performance as you get with diesel vehicles. So for us, the answer for what can you do today to improve your environmental performance is natural gas. Very much the right vehicle for emissions, the right vehicle for noise, the right vehicle for effectiveness for the total cost of ownership. And more importantly, it's a vehicle it's a range of vehicles which is available now. It's fully industrialized. This is not niche production. And it's today's answer rather than waiting for utopia in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time. This is something that you can do now. Challenges for us to really move it forward, just a few bullet points. LNG infrastructure is getting better by the moment. It's still nowhere near where it needs to be. If I look across Europe, we're actually up to a reasonable number of stations, but compare it against diesel stations, and it's about 1% against diesel stations. So there's a road to go. The LNG infrastructure providers are all keen and interested to do it, but obviously we have to work with them because they need us to sell vehicles for them to put in infrastructure, and we need infrastructure to sell vehicles. So very much a partnership between the fuel suppliers and the vehicle manufacturers. Vehicle availability has been a bit of an issue over the last few years, but ourselves and our competitors are now expanding the range of vehicles to cover not just some very high volume vehicles, but also some of the niche markets as well. We still see some uncertainty from operators about durability due to negative experiences they had with some of the retrofit dual fuel technologies over the last few years. The only way to get around that is to get the vehicles out there running and prove to them that they are reliable. Residual values is another area where there is uncertainty. We've got 50 plus years of experience of selling diesel vehicles, and there are people who make a living out of predicting the value of a diesel vehicle in 3, 4, 5 years' time. There is really no market for second-hand gas vehicles yet. That will come if the total cost of ownership of running the vehicle for the first life customer is good. It will be good for the second life customer. So there will be a market for it. It's just we've got to build that market gradually as we go through over the next few years. The challenges for public bodies really are to make sure that fuel duty differentials are maintained. What we don't want is customers to be buying vehicles to buy them on the basis of a certain economic payback period and total cost of ownership, and halfway through the life of the vehicle, the government changes the rules. That's one which we've got to avoid. And if we want to get down the road of putting more gas vehicles on the market, it's absolutely vital that the total cost of ownership has got to be positive against diesel. We need governments right across Europe to be on message that natural power gas vehicles are positive for the environment. So the German government have done quite a lot recently and very good. The British government are decidedly slow. And the other thing which we need is to get acceptance that when low emission zones are starting to ban diesel vehicles, that they allow gas vehicles to come in at least for a period longer. Maybe not forever, but at least for an interim period. So, conclusion, IVECO, partner for sustainable transport. So I've covered gas, and I think it's now Marco will cover electric.
Thank you very much.